how long does it take to write a book? From start to finish? What is the process and how long does it take before that book is actually on the shelves?
Wow. Well, between the time you turn in a book in what would be kind of its quote final form to an editor, final on your end of things before editing, to the time it's published, maybe well over a year. It sometimes is less than that. Sometimes projects are going more quickly, and it might be 9 months. But then you go into a fairly lengthy process of manuscript to your editor. Sometimes sits on the editor's desk because editors are busy, and it might be 2-3 weeks or more before he even or she starts to look at it. It's one of the things that when authors get together that they talk about how they killed themselves to make the deadline and their editor didn't look at it for 6 weeks and they thought, if I would have had that extra 6 weeks, I could have actually gotten some sleep, and it wouldn't have made any difference. But from an editor's point of view, they have way more stories to tell you about authors. So I sympathize. But and in terms of how long it takes you to write a book, it varies, widely with the kind of book you're writing. When I'm writing one of my big books, and what I'd call my big books, now let's talk in terms of nonfiction, are the definitive books that are comprehensive, would be the word, I guess. And that would be, for me, Money, Possessions, and Eternity, which is like a biblical theology of money. Pro-life answers to pro-choice arguments, which is pretty comprehensive in terms of the pro-choice argumentation and pro-lifers, how do we respond to that, 700 and some footnotes in it, all of that. The big Heaven book, just called Heaven, and If God is Good. Now, what each of those big books have in common is that they took a lot of time to write. But in each case, they have resulted in smaller spin-off books that didn't take nearly as much time. Not simply because those books are smaller, though that's part of it, but because you can utilize the same research and sometimes some of the same writing that you've actually done, but now you've put it into another form. So the big Pro-Life Answers book became the basis for which I could write the little book, Why Pro-Life. The big Money, Possessions, and Eternity became the basis upon which I could write the small Treasure Principle. And a new book that I've just finished editing that relates to it's called a pocket guide to money and possessions. At least that's the name now. We'll see what the name is. That's another issue. Yeah. Titles getting changed. But where I was able to take the larger work and draw from it in order to make the smaller work. Likewise, with my book Heaven, there's 50 Days of Heaven, a devotional book. There's Touch Points Heaven. There's Heaven for Kids. There's the Little Heaven booklet. Then there's the children's books, all of which relate in some way to heaven. Wait Until Then, Tell Me About Heaven, Heaven for Kids. So all the work that I put into that one big book, Heaven book, has resulted in maybe 6 other books that were much easier and took a much shorter period of time to write. And likewise, If God is Good, my smaller book, The Goodness of God, extracted out of that, if I was to boil If God is Good down to something that would be 30,000 words, a very short book, what would it be? And that's what The Goodness of God is. And by the way, on the whole big book, smaller book thing, there's a lot of people who say, well, I really like the smaller books and I don't like the big books. And there are people who say, I really like the big books because I'm so interested in this subject. And I think it's important to recognize, and to me, my publishers have given me a lot of liberty in this area, and we're very fortunate because the sales of the books have been good enough to justify this. But there are people who want to know everything that there is to know, or that can be reasonably talked about in a book, about the subject of heaven. They have a loved one who's died and gone to heaven, and they don't want a pamphlet on it.
Right.
The booklet's fine, but they have way more questions than can be covered in the small book. There are other people who go, no, just give me a little bit.
Right.
Just give me a little bit so they can read the touch points of heaven, or give it to me in a devotional form, 50 Days of Heaven. Give it to me in a booklet that I can pass on to somebody else that's got the gospel in it. Then they got the heaven booklet. So likewise, there are people who have told me before, for instance, that Money, Possessions, and Eternity, that's a big, thick book. And, I really like it, but I've got some friends, I want to help them in stewardship, but they're not going to read a big book. And then they'll say, well, the treasure principle, I really like that, but that's just about giving. So now I've done this book that is coming out that is in a form that it covers the whole realm of financial stewardship, but is in a much smaller version, the pocket guide to money and possessions.
Kind of having something for everybody.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the same things with the children's book, because you don't have to, if your children's book relates to the subject of heaven, and 2 of the 3 children's books are stories. One of them a very short story, Wait Until Then, with beautiful art. And then my friend Ron DeCiani did the art for the Crossway book, Tell Me About Heaven, and that's great as well. And both of those are a grandfather and a grandson who are involved in it, yet they're quite different stories.